The Bible study that doesn't suck. This is Pastor Megan here in San Francisco at Grace Lutheran, and today's readings are right on topic for what is storming through our country. You'll notice I'm wearing the Freedom Bus t-shirt, remembering the people who did nonviolent, active work in the 50s and 60s and 70s in the United States. You'll also notice I have a little bit of a cough. It's asthma, and the more I talk, the more I cough. So hopefully water and cough drops will help us. I also have a voice that's about 2 octaves deeper than I normally speak, so that's fun. So it's been a tough week. And for those of you who didn't hear, my American flag is up here because we did some cleaning at the church. And my grandmother is the kind of person who used to take the time to make sure that flags were disposed of properly. And so I didn't like the idea that it was going to go into a dumpster bin somewhere. So it now lives behind me. There's a couple other flags over here that might show you the full spectrum of my progressiveness and what I'm standing for. But just wanted to name why there's an American flag behind me. I love this country. I love history, and I am the kind of person who is a historian who knows that in our past there are things that are problematic. There is no space in time that you can look at in the past that isn't riddled with sexism, isn't riddled with racism, isn't riddled with family secrets about addiction and mental health issues that have led to unfortunate family problems, whether it's domestic violence or other kinds of secrets that aren't helpful. I don't have judgments about the past. I don't think the people in the past should know what we know now or should believe what we believe now. I always hope that all people, no matter where they live in history, no matter where they live in the world, are able to do the best they can with the resources that they have. And so I yearn for the present and for the future of our world to be less racist and to be less homophobic, less transphobic, less erring on the side of men or people who have wealth. Having said that, as a Lutheran, I believe that all people are saints and sinners, and so that we have the burden, maybe, of seeing that in every person, no matter who they are, we all have a bit of the truth and we all have a bit of the untruth. And that's not even from Lutheran's idea of saint and sinner, that's from Gandhi. The idea is that everyone has a piece of the truth, everyone has a piece of the untruth. Probably the people that you don't like have more untruth than other people. That's kind of the nature of how we as humans see the world. Those we don't like, you got all the untruth, or most of the untruth, and a tiny sliver of truth. The people who agree with us or who maybe look like us have a tiny amount of untruth and a giant amount of truth. And yet, what we do at the same time that we renounce evil in the world, when we see it, at the same time that we renounce hate and racism in all of its form, especially in the KKK and neo-Nazis and others that have spoken out so vehemently, and especially in ways that lead to genocide and other untruths happening in our world. At the same time that we speak out against those things, we are still called to be people who are looking for the slivers of light and hope and truth and good news. And sometimes it's found in places we wish it wasn't found in, and sometimes it's not, just like we expected. But what Jesus is up to in the world, and particularly in this week's text in Matthew, which if you're using the straight up lectionary, which is a reading of the Bible that was instituted by some folk who kind of split the Bible readings up into three-year chunks, and a lot of mainline churches read the Bible in those ways. If you are going straight lectionary this Sunday, you start with a reading that says you have to keep a lot of rituals about washing and doing those things. And then you read a text from Romans wondering if God has abandoned us and what our role is in the world. And then you read a text from Matthew that says, I know you think I have to do all that hand washing stuff, but I really don't. And then Jesus tells a poop joke. It's not what comes out of us it's not what goes into us that defiles, it's what comes out of us. And that's about eating food and then you poop it. But it's also a statement about paying attention to our words and paying attention to what is happening in the world. But it's a rejection of saying, if you do this formulaic thing, if you do step 1, then step 2, then step 3, then step 4, then you are doing absolutely 100% the right thing. And you know that God loves you and names you and claims you. And you don't have to worry about who has big bits of the truth and who has small bits of the truth, because you followed things in the right order. Jesus is saying that there is no instruction book. Even if we're doing all the right rituals, we still have to not say mean things to other people around us. Even if we are sitting on the pew and stand up and sit down at the right times and we had the correct hymns and we worshipped the exact right way, that does not mean that we get to give false witness and slander. It does not mean that we get to give food that could go to vulnerable people to people who are not vulnerable. And so there are conversations about treating children with kindness, not giving children's food to dogs. And there are texts that are being very politically maybe kinder than Jesus is in some other texts when he appears with whips and overthrows tables. But this is a text that makes us all examine, no matter if we think we're coming from the correct side or if it's strangers who are saying things, particularly when it's a time when people are saying things and we've dismissed every word they say because of the person who says it. I have no idea if there's a person in our current history that we think everything they say is wrong no matter what. Maybe you've watched the news and you feel that way. But that we don't have the luxury, according to Jesus, to just dismiss everything because we don't like the person it comes from, or because we have done the right things in our life, so we don't have to examine ourselves in the words that come out of our mouth. That is not a luxury any of us has. Jesus is saying nobody gets a free pass. Everyone has to examine the words that they say, and if you're like me, then you might get crabby when you're hungry, and you might get crabby when you're stressed out, and you might say things that you regret, or you worded them in a way that you didn't know was going to offend people, or when just one snippet of it ends up in a newspaper, you're like, oh, I wish that wasn't the snippet, but yes, I said that. And you have to learn to live with all of the consequences that come from your actions and your words and your art, even when they are misinterpreted by people. And that's a much harder, maybe a more mature, but less likely to be what we are able to do 100% of the time. We have to be people who let go of how audiences perceive what we're up to, and then are also accountable for the ways they have misconstrued what we've said. And so that is a very hard place to live in as pastors and as congregants and as people who are hoping to lean into the good news as much as we can, because sometimes we spend a lot of time arguing why we're right when someone says that their feelings are hurt, and when we do that, no one ever feels better. Even if we help them realize that you are actually right, they still feel pretty crappy that you have taken all this time to explain why they are wrong. And so if we could be better at attuning ourselves to care for people's feelings, even when they are wrong, ooh, that's a hard one, we might be heading towards what Jesus is calling us to do in this Matthew text. It's a lot easier to just kind of like dwell in the poop joke and be excited that Jesus is talking about the process of food coming out of our intestines. And we could take from this Matthew text that it's okay to be sarcastic and it's okay to put people down with one sentence and put people in their place. But I think what's happening here is Jesus is encouraging us to wade into tough conversations, to sort out the ways that we are culpable, even in times when we are certain we are 100% right. And that means that we have to take a little bit more time to discern what is good news. We can't just dismiss people we think are terrible, because there might be specks of light there that are good news to us if we take the time to pay attention to it. I tell you this as a pastor who has spent 14 years listening to paranoid schizophrenics talk about their visions and the ways that they see God in the world, because I think as a pastor and as people of faith, if no one listens, particularly because someone says they're hearing the voice of God, whoofda. What would we do if a real prophet actually showed up? And so if we're not taking times to sift through what are voices that are helping us, what are voices that are helping us move towards and closer to God, and what are voices that are just stirring up our anger, even if it's righteous anger, or even if it's anger that fuels us to work towards justice, then maybe we should take some time to do that. No one at all is perfect, and no one at all has 100% of the truth. Jesus even has moments when he is held into account. The woman who wants her daughter healed and wonders why Jesus is throwing breadcrumbs under the table is someone who is calling Jesus into account and saying, hey, I deserve care, and put your money where your mouth is. And so it's an interesting text to have happening this week. You might have read your own political context into what I'm saying, and you might or might not be right. I really legitimately don't believe it's my job to judge people or to judge history, and I will forever take a stand against racism and take a stand against sexism and homophobia and transphobia and all of the ways that I'm able to take a stand against biases and hate that exist in the world. But you might also find that I am going to remind us of places where the light peeks through the cracks. And sometimes that's to change the narrative. Sometimes it's to make sure that we're not villainizing people. And sometimes it's to remind us that all people have the ability to evolve. I know that my own feelings and ways that I have been in the world has changed when where I have lived in the world has changed. My feelings living in San Francisco are different than my feelings when I lived in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And my feelings, being able to hear the perspectives of people who have different kinds of vulnerabilities than me, helps to change my perspectives. And living through experiences where someone takes what you said out of context or doesn't really care what you meant to say, they just are interested in making you look dumb. Sometimes those life lessons of living through suffering can be something that helps to shape the way you move towards justice the next time. So that's a couple of thoughts that I have on this. The other thing that I want to say is about the alternate reading that pastors are allowed to choose. It's in the Lutheran lectionary. It's called the semi-continuous reading, and it just means that you have the ability to choose between an Isaiah text this week or a Genesis text. And I want to point out the Genesis text this week because I think it's a great text for times like these. It was one of the readings used at the service in 2010 when LGBTQ pastors were brought back into the ELCA after they changed their policies and decided that we could serve on both sides of the communion altar. And it's a text. It's a text where Joseph of the Princess Dress and Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, who decided to take the Cain and Abel story like up a notch. Cain kills Joseph's brother. Want to kill him, but they decide that it's more financially lucrative to sell him into slavery than to just murder him outright, which takes on a different level of yuckiness in the story and is about how slavery happens. And if you know anything about how slavery happens in Africa, there are a lot of actual Africans who sold out people who were from different tribes or who were fighting against them because it was more lucrative than just simply killing them. And so this is one of the ways that slavery happens. In this story, the brothers sell Joseph into slavery and he ends up going to Egypt, but he makes good. Like, he overcomes. And Joseph articulates in the Genesis reading that his life is better because of this terrible injustice. And he tells his brothers that. You could read that as him forgiving them, or as him absolving them of their actions. But he's naming his personal truth, which is that his life is better because his brothers sold him into slavery than if they would have killed him. However, the way that they are reconciling does not happen with the brothers apologizing. The brothers don't apologize for selling him into slavery in this text. Instead, they are shamed because Joseph becomes the big man on town, and has to provide them with food during a famine, or they will die. So their choice not to kill their brother and to sell him into slavery leads to them not dying in the future. So it's a very complicated story. But what I point out in this reading is something that I think is maybe more like what happens for humans than what we see on TV, where something resolves very nicely, like someone dies and someone lives and justice happens, yay! Or at the end of a family drama, everyone hugs at the end. They're like, we really did love each other this whole time. What happens in this Genesis reading is that they don't reconcile in the way that we would imagine. The brothers never apologize. Joseph does name that he's better off, and not in a ha 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 ha, like I'll show you, and not in a ha ha you're starving kind of way. Joseph doesn't get revenge. Instead, what happens between the brothers is they weep on each other. So Joseph weeps so much on the neck of his brothers that it like drips down. I know what that's like because when I preached about what was happening in Charlottesville on Sunday, I weeped so much that there was a lot of dripping, and it was gross because the Kleenexes were on the other side of the sanctuary. I'd still preach the sermon, but next time I'd move the Kleenex. Right? So this is a story where they don't fully resolve their issues, and you gotta wonder if you've had a family that's had a lot of difficult things like this, that when you don't get an apology, sometimes you can still come to Thanksgiving, but you're a little bit on edge because no one apologized for the terrible thing that happened to you, and so you're always wondering when the shoe's gonna drop. And so they don't have full reconciliation. They don't have full forgiveness. Instead, they weep on each other. And I think that's where we are as a country right now. There are, like, imagine, there was an article, I think it was in the Washington Post, or something like that. I'll put a link down here. There was a father whose child participated in this Charlottesville stuff and has talked about how difficult it's been because their child has been very hateful, and that they're actually afraid of this person because of how militant and aggressive they're being. So they were denouncing, like, the action that had been taken. They were talking about how people were threatening them because they had saw the child at these rallies. They had confirmed that this was not a value or a lesson that they had learned in their own house. And yet, the father did not completely condemn the child forever. They said, they're not welcome in my house. They're not currently safe. But I will rejoice on the day that the prodigal comes home. And this is a reference to another story from the Gospel of Luke, a story where a son demands the inheritance before his father has passed away, goes off, blows all the money on hookers and booze and things like that, then ends up hungry and poor and comes back to the father's house to beg to be a servant and to eat the slop of the pigs, because even that would be better than just dying. And so kind of comes back in a humiliated way. And instead of saying, ha ha ha, I told you so, the father throws a feast. And so in this article, the father of one of the people at the supremacist rally said, I will not be feasting until my child comes home and is able to like be with us again. And so I was really moved, not only by that use of the Bible for good rather than for making other people feel terrible, but if in the moment of fear, in the moment of loving a child, this dad has the ability to articulate, I hate every word that comes out of my kid's mouth, but someday I'm going to feast when they come home, and we're not going to be fully complete until this being that I made from scratch is able to join us and to be a part of the good news that's happening. And ultimately, I think that's such a perfect parable for what God is up to in the world. God says that we are God's children, so that when we do things that are reprehensible, that are going against God, or as Psalm 30 says, my anger is but a moment, my love is forever. I see this so perfectly represented in this father, whether he's able to live it out or it was just a pretty thing he said in the paper. I don't care. For the purposes of this Bible study, I want God to treat all of us like that father feels about that anti-Semitic son. And not in a like, hate the sin, love the sinner kind of way, but in this idea that when we are up to something that misses the mark, when we divert from the path, that God wants us to come home. And if it's like the prodigal, doesn't need us to apologize. Excuse me. In fact, in the experience of the prodigal, the father interrupts the apology and just says, come on and have these robes and eat. And so a God who understands that we are going to screw up and enjoy it sometimes. And this God longs for us to come back to God and is going to throw a feast regardless of whether we apologize or not. And maybe some who have been really disappointed in us are going to weep on our shoulders. But this isn't a revenge moment. The parable of the prodigal is not a revenge moment. There are moments in the Bible that are about revenge. Make all those people burn and die because they're so unjust. That even just imagining that makes us feel like we're getting justice from God. This is not one of those moments. And I think what our goal is as Bible-following good news people, and let me say it again as I said it from the pulpit on Sunday, we do need to take into account the fact that people who are Nazis use the same Bible I use. And there are verses in there that support the work that they are doing. People who were a part of the Holocaust lifted up the words of Martin Luther, and I'm celebrating the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, but by golly, I am going to repudiate and repent from those words that led towards the Holocaust. People in the American Lutheran Church have self-segregated for a long time. We had congregations that were separated by the language that they spoke, and we have organizations that continue to say we are upholding heritage, and that means you got to be German like me, or Norwegian like me, or Scandinavian like me, and we have to watch out because our desire to care for our ancestors, to learn where we came from, to have cool arts and crafts, to eat the desserts that make us feel very reminiscent for holidays past, sound an awful lot like words that were being said to justify anti-Semitism. So we have to be careful how we use those words into the future, and maybe those words are ruined forever. I'm taking a trip in December, and I'm going to go to visit Switzerland, where my 14th great-grandfather was a saint, and you can see videos about that and learn more about that as I go. So I am someone who cares about culture, and as I said before, I really love history. But if we're not able to name the racism and the sexism and the things that were happening in those cultures, then we are in danger of doing the things that we hate in other groups. And so we have to figure out how we're going to repudiate this need to self-segregate in the American Lutheran Church. We need to work on that in ourselves. Maybe it's just the things we said in high school or in college. Maybe it's the things that we say that we didn't know were terrible until we know. Maya Angelou says, you didn't know, but that doesn't stop you from doing better. And so my encouragement is that we have to speak out and say explicitly that using the Bible for the purpose of excluding entire races of people is evil, right? White supremacy is evil, and it's a sin. And at the same time, the good news of the Bible is that no one is 100% separated from God. And in in some of the creeds that people proclaim and have proclaimed throughout the ages, they believe that during the time that Jesus was dead for 3 days, he goes down into hell and saves all of the terrible people that couldn't even get it on earth. They were so unjust. They had to go to hell, and Jesus goes down and saves them, and that's what he's doing in between the time that he resurrects and the time he floats up into the sky. So, it's complicated, it's terrible, and what the heck do we do with that crap, right? One of the places that I turn in times like these is to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was an ethicist who taught during the time of the Hitler regime in Germany, and he believed that God 100% believes you should not kill people, and he participated in a plot to try to kill Hitler with a suitcase bomb. It went off, but not near enough to Adolf Hitler to kill him, and so Dietrich Bonhoeffer ends up, as a result of that, in a concentration camp, and then ultimately gets killed in that concentration camp. Should Dietrich Bonhoeffer have killed? He says himself, no, never. There is no justification for killing. And he also says that God was calling him to kill Adolf Hitler. I personally am a pacifist. I don't see a moral reason for violence. Should people at an anti-Semitic rally, even though there are terrible people on the other side, beat them with clubs and sticks? No. But that might have been what they were called by God to do. And that is, as impossible as it is incomprehensible. That's a quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his PhD thesis called Sanctorum Communio, and I'll put a link down here. But that doesn't mean I'm called to do it. There might be people who are called to be a part of civil rights in that way, in the same way that Malcolm X took a different calling than Martin Luther King Jr. I'm more of a Bayard Rustin activist, which means I like to make sure there's enough peanut butter and jelly sandwiches that people eat and don't get crabby. I like to do the nonviolence trainings or divert a march so that they don't destroy buildings. So that's more what my calling is in the world. It doesn't mean that other people aren't called to take different stands in the world. It's just, right now, not mine to do. And so I find what is yours to do. It might be to be the person who brings the sound equipment, to bring the cool speakers and the microphones, because someone's got to stay with that equipment. Be the person who's making a really awesome webpage so that people know when that rally is going to happen, and so that the rally that is organized by people who are going to stay safe and sane and sober during an event are the ones who get all of the Facebook followers to come to their rally, as opposed to the people who are maybe leading a rally for their first time and not as aware of the kinds of safety behaviors that one ought to do to prevent dangerous things from happening to people. There's a lot of different ways that you can be called. You can be called to donate money to some of these cool causes. You can be called to be someone who, in your church, simply picks up the bulletins that are left in the pews on a Sunday so that your pastor has one less job, so that they can put their time and their energy into talking about issues like this. You can be someone who simply has a hard enough life and a hard enough battle with depression that you stay alive, and that's your sole job. And particularly in times like this, when the whole world is depressed and angry about everything, staying alive is a giant calling. So those of you who are doing that, I want to give you a shout out. Woo woo. Keep it up. And it's very important. We need more kind, great people to live, so they can hold the light or point out cracks where the light shines through in the deep, dark moments. Maybe you're a knitter. Maybe you are someone who can make awesome art. Maybe you're somebody who can help with the flow of traffic. Maybe you're someone who wants to coordinate with the police department near you to help make things be safer for all people who are participating. Maybe you're someone who cares about disability rights and is able to help make ramps happen. Maybe you're someone who can do construction, who can help make that ramp happen in a place where someone can't afford it, but it's able to help people have access to services and the ability to protest and be a part of justice movements. Maybe you're somebody who wants to go to a really fancy dinner and then donate that amount of money towards a cause that you really love, because taking care of your body is really what you need to do, because your work life is super stressful. There are lots of ways to be called, and I encourage you to find the one that works for you. You will see in the readings for Sunday a lot of different ways that you can be called, including being someone who calls out Jesus and says, hey, even the children need the crumbs from under the table. Stop feeding them to the dogs. You can be someone who is telling a poop joke. That's the role of Jesus in the Matthew text. You can be someone who's weeping. You can be someone whose neck gets wept on. You can take a lot of different kinds of roles during this time. And so my hope is that you will feel safe and blessed, and that all people will be walking closer to justice. I want to talk a little bit as kind of a final note about paths. Remember when I talked about like diverting from the path of God? In the ancient language about paths, where it says that you will go on the way to God, it doesn't mean like a sidewalk or a paved road. It means like the kind of trail you find in a park because everyone walks it all the time, or more specifically like wagon wheel ruts. The kind of ruts you find in a gravel road after it's rained and dried and rained and dried and rained and dried, where you can find old trails that are 100 years old and no one's walked on them, but still the path is there because it's so deeply ingrained. These are the kinds of paths that Jesus is calling us to follow towards God. Follow these. May the way that you are supposed to be going in the world be a deeply rutted path, so that following God is easy. And then when we talk about these paths being made straight, that's not about like being a straight person or about having an easier way to get somewhere. It's about those old rutted paths. If you've ever tried to walk on them, it's easy to trip and it's easy to fall on them. So it's making them obvious and easy to follow, but flat enough that you don't fall on your face on the way. And so my blessing and my hope for everyone who makes it this far in the Bible study is that you will know the way towards God, that you will be able to follow the path that is yours to take as we move ever closer to justice, and that those paths will be laid out in a way that you don't twist your ankles and find undue stress or get yelled at by people who don't understand you. And so may the blessings of God be with you and for you. May the blessings of God help you have the courage and the strength to look deep within yourself to the places where racism and homophobia have stuck inside of you and skin has grown over it because you've forgotten that there were bits of it inside of you. And may the grace and strength of God guide you forward in a way that helps you welcome others who are evolving with you to be at that great feast with you. Because until we're able to feast together, it's not really a feast. So I love you and God loves you, and keep it up. Love y'all. Bye.